So I'll just jump right into it. I decided to have us do a little UI analysis. If you aren't familiar with me, I am Renaud Marshel, the club co-president. Um, but anyway, so user interface is one of the most underrated things about video games, but we notice it very quickly when something is bad about it. And so I was just thinking that if we took 10 minutes to just kind of look at some good examples and look at what the driving concerns for how you design user interface for games specifically, because it's different for websites and all of that other stuff. So up front, there's a main split between user interface. There's the diegetic and non-diegetic. Diegetic user interface is something that is part of the narrative in the game. Sometimes it's that the way that characters in the game can recognize it, and other times it's not. It's more of a meta narrative. Um, some of the most recognizable examples, like Fallout, the Pip-Boy, the computer monitor that you wear on your wrist, that is a an amazing example of a diegetic UI because your character actually lifts the arm up, looks down at the wrist to bring up the user interface. Dead Space, you have a health indicator on your back, and ammo indicators visible on the weapons. Any sort of score in a sports game that is on a board in the game world is also an example of a diegetic interface. For non-diegetic, it's something that we're all familiar with. It's basically anything that doesn't make sense in the game. Health bars, um, ability cooldowns. So just some examples. So the Fallout Pip-Boy, like I was saying, when you have the diegetic interfaces, you tend to want to make it something more realistic in that world. If the theme becomes extremely important. Um, you're a little less worried about cramming everything into the interface and more trying to make it feel real in that game. So Dead Space here, like I was saying, the health indicator on the back here. I'm not sure if you can see you can see my cursor. So the health indicator on the back, and then this weapon indicator, both the ammo and the aiming reticle. So diegetic is something that is either in the game world or explained through the game world. So there's even diegetic music. If there is music playing in the game that characters in the game can hear, or that the characters in the game are singing, that's diegetic in the sense that it's in the game world, but also for you as the player. So this would be what I think is the triangle of game concerns: um, theme, usability, and clarity. The difference between game user interface and interface for websites and whatnot is theming is extremely important for game user interfaces, where websites, it's all about the usability, clarity, and just like general presentation. No one's going to come to a website and say, oh, this theme is off what I'm looking at. Whereas if you go to a different game, if you're looking at a casual game and it's got the user interface of a hardcore MMO, something is not going to mesh very well with the player. Some example of what falls into each of the categories: theme is visual design. Does the information that's presented fit the narrative or expected feelings of the game? So if it's a horror game, you're usually going to have a lack of information that is very important to the theme and the structure of how you set up your interface. Whereas if it's an action game, you'll try and get tactical information that's being presented on the interface, or have more technology that the player can be aware of for timings and location and um, things along that line. For visual design, like the some of the most iconic visual design is something from Diablo. Diablo has structured its UI in such a thematic way that almost every action RPG that follows after it has the same approach to their visual design in terms of the user interface. Clarity, so the legibility, having your text in such a way that it's light colors on dark colors or vice versa. Um, the white space surrounding information and how much you're making the player switch context in between screens of your user interface can make a big difference on how clear information. Usability is getting at the how useful is the information that is presented at any given moment. Is it something that they have to dig 4 screens into to get to the information they're looking, change the setting they're looking for? Um, do they have to cycle around a bunch of different menus in a bad way, such as I think it was the Smash 4 user interface, where it was just a bunch of different things you clicked on, and then you had to just know what kind of groupings they were in instead of it having a clear sub menu, so you would know when you're hovering over this selection what items are coming next when you select it, like they had in earlier iterations of the Smash interface. So the game that comes to mind first for me with good user interface is Into the Breach. It is all about visual clarity, giving the information the player needs up front so that they can make good decisions. Each icon has a specific meaning. So the hashed lines under the buildings and the mechs means that's an area that's under threat for the next turn. The little icons over the mechs tell you that that mech has not used its turn yet, either for moving or attacking. The arrows indicate which direction or which monster and what direction the monster is attacking in. Here's another one. It's a little bit more busy, but it's also showing that everything is going to happen in a specific order. If there was units that were under fire damage or smoke damage, storm damage, they would take that damage up front. Then the environment actions would happen, these around the map. Then the enemy actions in a specific order, and then new enemies appear in this area, and they keep consistent icons. So the enemies emerging has this icon, the numbers are the same, the icon for the environment damage is the same. Um, and then enemy has a specific type of attack that is you can kind of identify based on the drawing patterns of the icons coming out of it. So this one is a lobbing attack. This one attacks in all directions. So you know how to interact with the enemies to um, get at what you need to get at. So the player could potentially guess if they knew the mechanics inside and out, but there's no setting that they would need to turn on. In this case, this is just the information that's presented to the player based on whatever actions being taken. All of the information the player needs is given to them. The only thing that's not immediately shown is the attack order. So you have to actually highlight that to know what order things are happening in. But after you see it a few times, you'll get the general idea that everything in the environment's happening first, then the enemies, and then new enemies emerge. So you only need to check the attack order if you're trying to have specific timing for when you're interacting with different enemies. Into the Breach is a strategy game, first and foremost. Um, so if it doesn't present the information for the players to make decisions in a strategic manner, then it really starts undercutting itself as a strategy game. Pokemon is more of an RPG game, so it can have mechanics that aren't clearly laid out for the player. And you just have to start learning when to have that player intuition of which Pokemon is more likely to go first, which move is more likely to go first, and if there are moves that change the general speed of the attacks, like Swift, for instance. So, yes, it would get less clarity in that diagram. However, it would be more thematically aligning with what it's going for. So, Persona 5 is the single best example of high theme in a user interface. It's to the point that people cosplay as the Persona 5 interface. The game just oozes this theme. So it's not like the interface is out of place. It's just one more part of oozing this very over the top and exciting theme to the entire game. And the user interface just takes it one step further. But at the same time, it doesn't disregard information clarity and usability. You don't have to drill down into a bunch of menus to get to what you need to. Each of your main um, interactions is just one button, and then the ones that need special selection, such as your item or using different skills, that will bring up a new menu to for you to select the options there. There is always a button key on the screen, so you never are confused about what you can do. The information on the health of the enemies is always visible. The health of your characters, the skill points or special points, I forget which the actual word is, but the points they use to cast abilities is always visible. It's not shown here, but as you start using different abilities on the enemies, you get to understand what enemy is strong and weak against it, and it displays that information to you as you're selecting. Eve Online is where it does have a nice theming, but it's going for utility and usability above all. So each one of those screens has a specific use, and it's not everyone is not going to use all of the screens all at once. But for someone that's in this looks like fleet combat in a null security space, they need to have most every one of these windows open in order to get through whatever PvP activities they're about to get into safely, or as safe as can be in PvP scenarios. Eve is information overload for a lot of people. It's it has the nickname spreadsheets in space for a reason. WoW has that same concept of almost everything is useful for the player. And so there's a strong tendency to have a bunch of different user interface elements all over the screen. And that's true of almost every MMO, really. The the ones that get away from it the most might be Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy 14, but even they have that same issue underneath it all. So Mini Metro is the one that I think of most that's maximizing in all three areas while at the same time having the core concept minimum. Everything that you see here that looks like it should be interacted with, interactable, is interactable or presents key information. So these endpoints you can grab and move to the next um, station that'll appear wherever it appears, or you can grab and move it to remove the train line that has already been placed so you can reorganize how the trains are set up. The interface is designed with simple shapes, and each shape indicates what a person is trying to get to in a different area. So this is a square and it's got a triangle and a circle. That's a person trying to get to one of these circle spots, and then a different person trying to get to a triangle spot. So you know right away how you need to structure your train line. As the game goes on, it gets very complicated in managing how many train lines you can have, how long it takes the cars on the train, which are unfortunately hidden because they're at each station right now. It how long it takes to travel between each station and how long the customers are going to wait patiently at each station, and that's where you get the fail state in in the normal gameplay mode. Whereas if you have too many people waiting at a station for too long, that's when the game's over. So this is the last slide, and it's about you as the developer needing to identify what you think is the most important for the player in any given moment. And you look back at that uh, the triangle of concerns. Are we trying to keep pushing the theme? Are we pushing clarity of information? Are we pushing usability information? Everything, nothing? Because you can have a game that has almost no user interface at all, and it still be a good user interface depending on the context of the game. If you are presenting important information, make sure it's not surrounded by a bunch of distracting effects and extra text, at least not in any way that prevents the information from being legible. The example that we saw shared, what, 2 weeks ago was the Trackmania or whatever the name of that game is, where the racing user interface is ridiculous, covering most of the screen for no real reason. And in most cases, a rule of thumb is if information that is supposed to be the most important, it should be the most prominent on the screen, either directly where the player is looking or in a larger text or a specific color that's not used much on the screen or gets its own panel that is not surrounded tightly by a bunch of other information. That's the thing that you want to set aside as your most important piece of information. I try and share my love of user interface faces with everybody. As a general rule, unless you are experienced, a simpler UI system would be better, but there's that possibility of you keeping too much information from the player or letting the player interact with your game the way they really want to if you go too simple. It really depends on the game. If your game is going minimal, you want more a simple UI. If it's a very in-depth kind of 4X strategy game, you would definitely want to go more complex in general. But it really is about how many mechanics you have in the game that you want the player to interact with and be knowledgeable about. There are strategy games that have gone very minimal, use simple UIs in that process. And then there are what some people would be some of the most simple games out there, just like clicker games that have pretty complex UI. This is a site that came up recently, interfaceandgame.com, and it has a bunch of different collections of screenshots of user interface for various different games. So you can have something to get a general idea of what you could be aiming for. You just find a game that's kind of close to your theme and genre, you can see what players tend to like to see in user interfaces in games in that genre and theme. And yep, that's it.